Good evening, everyone. I hope that you're happy and safe, taking care of yourself and so on. I'm relaxing here on my back porch, listening to the various sounds from the other side of the door of my family, preparing the evening meal and so on. However, I thought it would be appropriate for me to give you some pointers pertaining to the principal important issues regarding deviance. Deviance and social control are our topic for this week. And the reading assignment, of course, is already posted, and you can see that. But what is important are the points that I'm going to share with you in just the next few moments. I have to tell you, before I start here, that I actually made this presentation before, and because of the lack of proper equipment, it was an unsuitable recording. So this is my second go around with it. I seem to move a little fast. Remember, you can always stop and rewind if necessary. So anyhow, I guess here we go. Deviance is a particularly important part of sociology because, you may recall, before sociology existed, Auguste Comte realized that in order to solve society's problems, one must first be able to investigate them. So the issue of solving social problems and recognizing them has always been central to sociology. Hence, deviance, in its most extreme and worst form, criminality, is something which has been an issue for society, particularly since the dawn of the Industrial Revolution. Emile Durkheim, the most important contributor to the academic discipline sociology, was careful to consider deviance. His examination of the division of labor in modern society argued that the social structural cohesion that characterized the modern period was one based mainly upon economic interdependence, no longer on what he called conscience collective, or collective conscience, no longer united by beliefs. We were now united by our dependence in relationship to our occupation, which made success in a material way very, very important. In fact, the most important thing. This modern form of social cohesion that Durkheim called organic solidarity was one that is also characterized by social strain, a tension between being able to achieve economic success and security, given the variable access to the means by which to achieve it that people in society have, depending upon their race, their gender, their religion, and their social class. In the extreme form, this social strain, you may recall, was referred to as anomie, a society wherein which rule breaking becomes the norm, becomes commonplace at least, and in fact, on the most basic level, very, very few ideas about what's right and wrong are actually shared. But the shared conception of what is acceptable or not acceptable, desirable or undesirable, is based upon the economic interdependence, the economic materialist structure of modern society, with its broad and diverse set of occupations, each one requiring us to dedicate our entire lives to it. This social strain in the extreme form, anomie, encourages people to circumvent the laws, the rules, the regulations that would otherwise block them from accessing wealth, power, and/or economic and material security, and that equates to crime. So as I said, since the earliest days of sociology, Emile Durkheim took on the challenge of confronting deviance conceptually. He argued that deviance is something found in all societies. It is a cultural universal, and as you should know from earlier in the course, cultural universals are those components of society which are found in every single culture. According to Emile Durkheim, cultural universals must necessarily be somehow functional for society. They must serve society. They must do something to contribute to society's balance, order, and stability. So, while norms obviously make society possible, the violation of norms is something found in every single society. How is it that deviance, the violation of norms, could somehow actually contribute to society's balance, to its order, to its stability? How could it somehow function for society? That's the question that Durkheim sought to answer. The discussion makes me think of a time when I was about to graduate from college and I was invited to an elite and exclusive museum on campus at the University of Colorado. This was a museum you could only visit by invitation. It was a museum that showed artifacts of some of the most famous and tremendous scholars and former students of the University of Colorado. It's called the Heritage Museum. Today it's been expanded, but in those days it was a tiny, tiny museum. It was located on the top of an old bell tower in the oldest building on campus, Old Main, which had been donated by the farmer in 1876 when the land and the campus itself was first made a part of the state, the new state of Colorado. Anyway, this particular museum had a round room, and around the perimeter of the room were pictures of the graduating classes. The first graduating class, second, third, fourth, fifth, probably through perhaps the 30th or 40th. In those days, people took such things seriously. Graduating classes stood for photographs together. At any rate, the very first graduating class was probably 4 people, all men. The next one, maybe 10 or 11 people, all men. Then the next one, probably about 20, 25 people and a woman. After that, 40 people and 5 women. After that, 70 people and 10 or 15 women. And as I walked around the wall and looked at each of the photographs, I saw that more and more women were graduated from the University of Colorado, were actually departing from the expectations of their society for them at the time, or deviating. Because those first graduates, those first women who graduated from that university were seen as deviants by most of the people in their society. The gender roles were very strict. They were expected to stay at home, take care of their children, take care of their husbands, teach, clean, weave, sew, etc. And these women instead were empowering themselves. They were getting professional credentials. They were entering into the society of work. This was deviant. Why was it deviant? Because the economy of the time was a single earner economy. Each man earned enough to support his wife and his children, even on very low pay. But each woman that entered into the workforce that took a man's job was actually taking not only the food out of that man's mouth, but the food out of his wife's mouth and his children's mouths as well. And believe me, in the late 1880s, early 1890s and so on, this was seen as very, very deviant. So the reason I tell you this story about females entering into the ranks of the academy, the ranks of higher education in the latter part of the 19th century is because deviance in this instance clearly was the mechanism whereby which more positive adaptations emerged. So deviance brings about positive social change. Deviance facilitates change. And I think that we can safely say that the addition of co-eds to the higher educational system has most certainly improved it. On a second note, at this time in my regular lecture class, I would ask each and every one of you who had ever been cited for violating the 70-mile-per-hour law on interstate highways in the state of Louisiana to raise your hands. Each of you that had raised your hand, I would have called on you. And when I'd called on you, I would have asked you what the speed was that the officer had put on your ticket. Now, the idea here is that we would be gathering data, usually in a class of, say, 75 or 80, the typical size of my introductory sociology classes. We will get 7, maybe as many as 10 or 11 individuals, students who have, in fact, had the misfortune of being stopped and cited on the Louisiana interstate highway system for violating the law in a 7-mile-per-hour zone. Each time a student gives us a speed, we get more data. At the end of each data collection process, once I've addressed each student and found out, had them speak out loud what the speed was that was on their citation, then the class is led to the conclusion, or pointed towards the conclusion, that the lowest data point represents a point at which we can weakly assume to be just above the parameter of acceptance. In other words, we live in a modern society, a society characterized by anomie. Rule breaking is commonplace. None of us drive at 70 miles per hour on the interstate. Almost all of us, with virtually no exceptions, drive faster. But how fast can we drive without being stopped? There is a parameter of tolerance around the violation of the rule, and this is the case for rules in society in general now, particularly in the modern time. When someone is deviant and they, shall we say, supersede, go beyond the parameters of tolerance, they are sanctioned. Getting a ticket for exceeding the speed limit is being sanctioned. So when they're sanctioned, they help to clarify the rules for the rest of us, and that's functional to social structure in society. So a second way that deviance is functional from Durkheim's perspective is that deviance helps to clarify the rules. On yet another dynamic, let me refer to you a story of my own shenanigans when I was a very young man and not very intelligent, quite irresponsible in some ways. I was hitchhiking across the United States with my life basically in my backpack. Cooking tools, this, that, lights, cameras, books, food, all of it, sleeping bag, the whole 9 yards, on a giant backpack that I carried on my back, and I would stand on the side of the highway with my thumb out and get into the automobiles of total strangers, frequently stand on the side of empty highways for extended number of hours. At any rate, it was not something that someone should do, but at one particular point in my journeys, I was on my way to the Lincoln National Forest for a 40-day excursion, a planned point of solitude, if you will. And the nearest point in New Mexico, as a city or a town goes anyway, to the Lincoln National Forest where I was headed, is Alamogordo, New Mexico. I arrived in Alamogordo at about 3 a.m., and when I did, I decided to wait until the following morning to rent a motel room in order to maximize my use of the room. I wanted to shower and rest and eat well and so on before I went up to the edge of the desert and the mountains meeting. At any rate, walking around downtown Alamogordo in the middle of the night, very small town in the desert, basically a strip down the middle, with a highway down the middle, with only a large diesel truck going by in one direction or the other, empty, I happened upon the Alamogordo Zoo. As I walked through the zoo, the animals were quite weirded out, kind of, it was strange for them to see me, and it's just like it was strange for me to see them. They quite clearly had never seen anyone walking through the zoo at 3 o'clock in the morning. But I made it all the way back to the lion's cage. The lion was laying lazily but quite wide awake looking at me, and it had its head laying across its paws like lions do, but as I said, eyes wide open and looking at me, and I got a wild hair up my ass, and I just decided I was going to try to get this lion to roar. So I gave it everything I had. I yelled, as loud as I could. I tried to make a giant roaring noise. The 500-pound cat looked up at me with great annoyance and not impressed whatsoever. But that being said, I decided I'd give it another shot, and I did, and that still didn't work. And I gave it one more shot, and it still didn't work. So I decided I was going to walk away and leave the zoo, and as I started to turn, I guess the big orange backpack on my back must have activated something in the cat's mind, and I want to tell you, that cat pounced at the cage with giant claws, with fingernails made of razor blades an inch long or longer. Had I not been safely constrained by bars outside of the bars of the cage, I probably would have been harmed. The goosebumps that raised on my body were tremendous, and usually when I tell this tale, I get a little case of that just from remembering it all happening. But here's the point. If we were in the classroom together right now, and suddenly there were a lion outside the door, we'd get to know each other in another way. We're a secondary group. We're impersonal. We're here to take care of sociology. But if there were a lion outside, we would have to get close to one another. We would have to unite. We would have to work together for our collective well-being. That is how Deviance functions in the third way, according to Emile Durkheim. Deviance helps to unite or unify a group. When a person or some group, say for instance within a society, is either guilty of or alleged to have committed some heinous act which the society itself disdains, then the society unites around the symbolic extraction of that person from the group and treats that person as a threat to the entire group. And so Deviance is functional in that it unites a group. So Deviance facilitates change, Deviance unites a group, and Deviance, of course, clarifies rules. Durkheim also talked about social strain, as I believe I shouldn't have to remind you. Social strain is a tension between the desire to be materially successful and the ability to accomplish that. Another theorist, a 20th century sociologist, working after Durkheim on the basis of his theoretical foundation, Robert Merton, developed a theory in Deviance called social strain theory. Both Merton and Durkheim are contributors, remember, to the structural functionalist perspective or paradigm within sociology. Merton's social strain theory effectively says that there are 5 ways that an individual can adapt to social strain. All of us are forced to adapt to it in one way or another. Most of us adapt through the first mechanism of adaptation, if you will, or the first adaptation, and that is conformity. We both accept what society tells us we should do to be successful. We work hard, we save money, we defer gratification, we become educated, we get credentials. We do all those things that's necessary for material success. And we obviously are pursuing material success. Obviously, why would we go through all that otherwise? But not everyone has the same access to the legitimate mechanisms, the legitimate means, if you will, whereby which to attain material success. But about if you happen to be a very, very intelligent individual, but you were born into an economically deprived set of circumstances, possibly to a single teenage mother who didn't value education or maybe wasn't literate herself. Perhaps you got into trouble at a young age, or who knows exactly why, but you were extracted from or separated from your opportunities in the educational system, but yet you were very intelligent. And you live in a world where you see that material success is what people enjoy and what society teaches us what we should want. Hence, you pursue material success, but you have blocked access to the legitimate means whereby which to achieve it. That particular adaptation, the second adaptation to social strain, according to Robert Merton, is called innovation. The innovator is the criminal. They're the person who circumnavigates the legal mechanisms whereby which to achieve material success and does it the way they have to, does it the way they can. Most innovators, from Merton's perspective, are persons with blocked access to material success, meaning people who are socially or economically disadvantaged. However, Merton does pay attention to the fact that some individuals who are innovators choose to be innovators rather than being forced to by their material or social circumstances. Another important adaptation to social strain, according to Robert Merton, is ritualism. The ritualist is the individual who goes through all the motions associated with attempting to attain material success, but realizing, for one reason or another, perhaps due to a lack of education or for other reasons, that they will never really attain material success. Yet they remain honest and participate in the workaday system as though it were going to deliver for them. This would describe a large number of the poor, according to Merton's way of thinking. Most people are not aware of this, but it became clear to me in some of the research that I've actually conducted that the vast majority of poor people do not commit crime, and that poverty is not correlated with property crime. And it's also not correlated with violent crime. Turns out the closest correlate with property crime and violent crime happens to be female-headed households, men or males who are born and reared in female-headed households without a male role model present. That's the strongest correlator, or the strongest variable that's correlated with both property crime and violent crime. So, a ritualist is the individual who goes through life honestly, even though it's not serving them in the way that our society would teach us that it should, which is by delivering material security and success. The next adaptation is the individual who seeks neither material success nor has any interest whatsoever in pursuing it in a legitimate way, and that is the retreatist. When I was first asked by a professor in class who I thought this might describe, it seemed to me that it might be a hermit, someone who chooses to live away from society in the woods. But I was made aware, in fact, that the retreatist, from Merton's perspective, is the chronic alcoholic and or the chronic drug user, in which case he means most specifically the opiate addict. These individuals live inside the bottle or inside the syringe. They drink themselves into oblivion throughout the day, and or, as in the case of the junkie, they wake up and inject the traces of last night's drugs in order to stop shaking and throwing up before they go and commit a petty crime and buy more drugs to remain in precisely the same state. Neither the chronic alcoholic nor the chronic opiate addict seeks sex or love or relationships or occupational success or success of any sort. They only seek to be re-encapsulated into the unfortunately artificial and harmful state of mind that they have come to be addicted to. The rebel is the fifth and final adaptation to social strain according to Robert Merton's categorical system. The rebel is the individual who has both a positive and a negative value on the legitimate means whereby which to achieve material success and what material success should mean. The rebel says it's okay to be a capitalist, but if you're going to be a capitalist, you need to do it with concern for the environment and concern for your labor force and concern for the consumer. The rebel says it's okay for us to work for a living. Most of us don't own the means of production, but should we work for 5 days a week for the better part of 9 hours, or should it be 4? Shouldn't we have guaranteed time off? The rebel is the person who says it's okay to be materially successful and have nice things, but do you need a giant trailblazer or a giant Jeep to move yourself around using extreme amounts of fuel and causing harm to the environment? when an elegant sedan would do just as well? Should we live in a 4,000 square foot house when 2,000 square feet is more than enough? And I'm talking about for the person living the exclusive, upscale lifestyle, not for the average working Joe, because my square footage here is probably about 900 feet, and I think that's a little closer to what most people experience. In short, the rebel is the individual who doesn't want to change the fundamental structure of society, but wants to tweak it so that the debt of society is more evenly distributed, particularly among those at the top who currently pay less than their fair share, and lessened in terms of what's taken from those at the bottom who are least able to contribute, but most called upon to do so by the current tax and regulatory system. The rebel is the individual who argues for the institution of a national healthcare system rather than continuing with the piecemeal private insurance method, which is unique and signature in terms of its exclusiveness to the United States. The United States is the only first world nation in the world, the only modern industrialized nation in the world that does not have a single payer nationalized healthcare system. The rebel is the kind of fellow who says, hey, the United States is the right place, it's a good place, it's well organized, but certain things about it need to be changed fundamentally, and those are the things which benefit the people, not the corporate sector, but the people. That's a rebel. So in review, Merton's 5 adaptations are the conformist, you and I, the innovator, which is the criminal, the ritualist, who is the individual who goes through the day-to-day work life, but knows they'll probably never be successful, honest nonetheless. And then the retreatist, who lives inside the bottle or the syringe. And last but not least, the rebel, the individual who sees society as being fundamentally correctly structured, but needing to be tweaked, needing to be organized slightly differently in certain ways. On the basis of the foundation of Merton and Durkheim's work, structural functionalists Cloward and Olin look at how deviance is driven not necessarily by a lack of access to opportunity, legitimate opportunity, but rather by the access to illegitimate opportunity. They give us, that is, Cloward and Olin give us opportunity theory. And opportunity theory argues that in order for a person to commit crime, they must have access to an illegitimate opportunity structure. Now, an illegitimate opportunity structure is a connection to the criminal underworld. For instance, if a person wanted to be a car thief, it would be absolutely necessary for them to have a connection to someone who had a chop shop. What's more, they would have to know the means whereby which to achieve this. But we'll cover that when we talk about another theorist in just a moment. Nonetheless, without a connection to a chop shop, there can be no successful car thievery. Stealing a car without a place to take it to is most certainly a waste of time. The same is true for dealing drugs and virtually every other crime. If a person steals a painting, they must have a fence that will buy the painting. If a person steals jewelry, they must have some sort of an illegal fence that will buy the jewelry. If they want to deal drugs or engage in some other similar activity, they must have a connection to get the materials that they wish to engage in purveying. So all of these indicate the same thing, that illegitimate opportunity structure is connection to an individual, one or more, in the underworld who can make crime possible. Cloward and Olin suggest that not everyone has access to such connections, such illegitimate opportunities, and this is most certainly true. Their implication seems to be, however, and I'm not so sure that I like this implication, that we're people to have more access to illegitimate opportunity, particularly people with blocked access to legitimate opportunity, there would be more crime committed by them. On a quite different but similar note, symbolic interactionists also have their ideas about deviance. Edwin Sutherland is a symbolic interactionist of the latter half of the 20th century, and Sutherland gives us something called differential association theory. Differential association theory argues that in order for an individual to conduct deviance, to commit deviance, to engage in deviance, particularly criminal deviance, this is really what he's talking about, it's absolutely necessary for them to be taught to do so, to be socialized by others to do so. In other words, you can't steal a car unless someone teaches you how to steal a car, what the methods are for stealing a car, what the techniques. What's more, there's a lot involved with committing acts that are harmful to others in a conscious manner. One must be able to first come up with rational motivations, and of course after the fact to be able to rationalize and be able to excuse the harmful behavior which they've been engaged in. In other words, how is it that I shouldn't feel sorry for this person whose life I've disrupted, this person who I've harmed? These are the sorts of things that people don't just learn or come up with they don't just come up with on their own. They indeed have to learn from others. And Edwin Sutherland argues in his differential association theory that deviance is learned in the same way that conformity is, through our connections to others. Sutherland goes on to say that the longer and more frequent and more close, intimate our relationships are with others who favor deviance over conformity, the more likely that we will actually engage in deviance ourselves, even if that wasn't our original inclination. So, Edwin Sutherland's differential association theory is an interactionist response to Cloward and Old. Another important contributor to the symbolic interactionist perspective on deviance was someone who actually precluded the gelling, the formation, if you will, of symbolic interactionism, as his work comes from 1926. His name is Edwin Lemert, and he's not mentioned in your textbook, but Edwin Lemert gave us what's called social definitions theory. Now, social definitions theory states that deviance cannot exist external to a social context. Lemert's idea is actually a fairly sound idea, because deviance, remember, is the violation of norms, and norms are shared expectations for behavior that are culturally and, of course, situationally and circumstantially specific. But the idea, though, is that in the absence of the existence of norms, that is, shared expectations for behavior in a particular situation, it's impossible to violate them. So deviance can only exist in the context of it having been socially defined as such. This lays out the foundation for what was to follow, and that particular theory is very important to deviance theory in our modern time, and we call that particular theory labeling theory. Now, although your textbook doesn't make reference to him, the scientist who came up with labeling theory, an individual whom I was lucky enough to have actually met once, was Professor Howard Becker. Becker essentially takes labeling theory, which had been established by Lemert, and develops it. Lemert is the individual who first comes up with the idea of primary and secondary deviance. Primary deviance making reference to the type of deviance that each and every one of us engages in, relatively minor deviance, maybe underage drinking or shoplifting, using your parents' car without permission, that sort of thing. Some of those primary deviance actions might be criminal or not, but the point nonetheless is that they're low-level deviance that pretty much everyone at one time or another has or does engage in. That being said, secondary deviance is career crime. Secondary deviance is the type of deviance that criminals engage in. Lemert was careful to differentiate between these two, but it was Howard Becker's work on labeling theory, later in the 20th century, much later, that actually sort of looks at the stepwise process whereby which a person acquires excuse me, a deviant master status, whereby which a person actually becomes a deviant. In other words, whereby which a person has a deviant label conferred upon them by the state in a stepwise process. Subsequent theorists have contributed to Becker's ideas, and labeling theory does recognize, and most certainly anyone who subscribes to labeling theory most certainly at this point recognizes that labeling is differential, and differential labeling has to do with the status of the individual being labeled. If the person has a great deal of social power, they may very well be able to avoid being labeled, and if they have very little social power, again, they may not be able to avoid that. However, just to give you an example of what I was just talking about with regards to differential labeling and differential social power, take an individual like Donald Trump. Donald Trump has, particularly when he was a candidate, just before being elected, it was revealed that he had said some fairly offensive things, including making reference to grabbing certain body parts and being able to murder someone else in the street without having any consequences. And even though these things would have been considered in past times to have been completely unprecedented and unacceptable and a reason for rejection and disdain, because Trump enjoyed a sufficient amount of social power, he was able to resist being successfully labeled in any negative way that interfered with his acquiring the office of the presidency. Louis C.K., however, a comedian, was someone who was very popular on television, was winning awards for his original broadcasts, writing and production and so on. But when it became revealed that he was sexually deviant in some relatively minor but quite, shall we say, agreeably offensive way, his credibility was lost completely, and this has been the case for many, many individuals in society. Matt Lauer, for instance, once one of the most well-respected and loved and liked individuals in the United States, now seen as a bit of an outsider or a deviant, and we tend to reframe our picture of how we think of a person once they've been labeled, once the label is collectively accepted about them. We tend to reorganize what it was that we thought about them and or how we thought about them, and we even can go back in our minds and try to attempt to reanalyze and redefine what their actions meant at previous times when we thought they were innocent. So, all of that should be taken into consideration. I will talk a great deal more about labeling theory, and today is Tuesday, but I expect I will release another video on Thursday, and I will attempt to sum up what you need to prepare for the examination next week on that next video lecture. But for now, I bid you all well, and stay safe, practice social distancing. We can work together to survive and succeed.